Good evening and welcome everybody. As Diane said, I'm Lance Young, sachem of the Walmsley Wolf Clan of the Namaskit Tribal Nation and an advisor to the Partnership of Historic Bostons. I thank you for joining us at the start of Native American Heritage Month for this important presentation of origin stories, the Pequot War and Indigenous enslavement in New England, which is the third lecture in the Partnership's fall series, Enslavement and Resistance, New England 1620 to 1760. This very important topic is actually at the heart of today's fierce battles over the teaching of early American history. In addition to the people here at the Boston Public Library, we welcome everybody on the live stream, which has several hundred people watching this live. Thank you and welcome. In Brethren by Nature, Margaret Newell lends her research and scholarly voice to the oral histories passed down from generations and generations of Pequots, with her compelling account that slavery in America began in New England with Native Americans. This practice laid the groundwork for the development of the racially based system of slavery that would be a defining scar in American history. The Pequot War itself had a lasting consequence for the tribe, and while the tribe of the 17th century never regained its former prominence or land, their descendants, the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation, has emerged in the 20th century as arguably the most powerful and influential indigenous tribal nation in America. Their journey from dispossession and marginalization to a thriving and self-sufficient sovereign indigenous nation is a testimony to how indigenous people can and do overcome the legacy of colonialism through the combination of cultural preservation, economic development, and community empowerment. And today we are fortunate to have Mashantucket Pequot tribal members on the stage with us, former Chairman Michael Thomas and the Director of Language, Rashad Young. They will speak to the critically important perspective of the Mashantucket Pequot as only they can. Margaret Newell is a distinguished arts and science professor and professor of history at The Ohio State University. She is the author of the subject of tonight's talk, Brethren by Nature, New England Indians, Colonists, and the Origins of American Slavery, and also From Dependency to Independence, Economic Revolution in Colonial New England. She has received numerous awards for Brethren by Nature, including the Peter Gomes Memorial Prize from the Massachusetts Historical Society and the James A. Rowley Prize for the best book dealing with the history of race relations in the United States from the Organization of American Historians. Brethren by Nature was supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, an Andrew Mellon Fellowship at the Huntington Library, and a John Nicholas Brown Center Fellowship. Michael Thomas is the former chairman of the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Council, which he served from 1994 until 2009. He is currently an elected member of the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center Board of Directors and executive assistant to the Mashantucket Pequot Elders Council. He has served as a board member for the National Association of Musicians, Vocalists, and Entertainers, and as a board member of media mogul Russell Simmons Rush Philanthropic Arts Foundation, and as the Environmental Health Director for the Mashantucket Pequot Tribe. Michael works tirelessly to preserve Pequot and other indigenous cultures and is a champion and advocate of indigenous youth empowerment and development. He has received many awards, including an honorary doctorate from Eastern Connecticut State University. Rashad Young is an enrolled member of the Mashantucket Pequot Nation. He also descends from the Narragansett, the Pokanoket, and the Namaskit tribal nations. He is the Director of Language for the Cultural Resources Department, where he is instrumental in efforts to revive the Pequot language and other indigenous languages in the region. He works to continue the cultural practices of his ancestors, and he is an indigenous artist and craftsman focusing on creating traditional bows and flutes, which he not only makes, but he also plays. Rashad has received a bachelor's degree in computer science from Wagner College. We are also fortunate and honored to have members of the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation here with us today. In the audience, including the Vice Chairwoman of the Tribal Council, Latoya Clough, the Treasurer of the Tribal Council, Merrill Reels, Tribal Councilor Daniel Menahan, former Tribal Councilor Shalita Sebastian Hall, We welcome you. Thank you for coming. For those that are on the live stream, you can put your questions in the chat at any time, and we will answer them at the end as time permits. And without further delay, please welcome Margaret Newell.
Thank you, everybody. And I wanted to thank Sarah Stewart and the Historic Boston's group, as well as Lance, for all of their hard work in putting this program together. I feel honored to be included, not just with this group of experts, but also with the amazing people that you brought in for the series. And I encourage you to continue to attend some of the upcoming talks that are part of this exploration of the New England past and its long history of slavery. So I stole this beautiful map from the wonderful historian Lisa Brooks, who is herself Abenaki, and has written a book about King Philip's War called Our Beloved Kin. This is from an earlier book of hers called The Common Pot, thinking about indigenous life in New England, in the Northeast. And what I like is her, that she's put all of the indigenous names for waterways, as well as the names of the various tribal nations. So this was their map and their world. In the eve of the English and Dutch and French colonization of this region that really took off in earnest after 1600. But you'll also see that a lot of these names are ones that we still use to describe the Connecticut River and other place names. The state of Massachusetts, his name is taken from a tribal nation. So, we have to think about ourselves living in New England and why we kept these names that erase the people. Native Americans were erased also from the history of slavery, I think in part because of the Civil War and the North versus the South and the North's sense of moral superiority on the question of slavery because of the North's involvement in abolition and for the many lives lost in the Civil War by Northern soldiers. But the fact is the North has a long history of slavery. America has a long history of slavery. And almost every European colonial empire, every European colonial adventure in the New World engaged in enslavement, and all of them engaged in enslavement of indigenous people. We now know, because of the work of many historians, that indigenous people, between 2.5 million and 5 million Native Americans were enslaved in the Western Hemisphere. That's a big number. It's only about a quarter of the number that we estimate for the African slave trade, but it represents an even larger proportion of the Native American population. So keep in mind these big numbers as I tell you the smaller story, but I think an important story of how slavery, legal slavery, the law of slavery emerged in New England. And I would say that New England's law of slavery, which emerged in 1641, was a product in part of the Pequot War and the desire to keep Pequot captives as slaves and involuntary servants. So to do a little bit of background on this conflict, this war that you may not be very familiar with, and on the Pequot Nation. So I'm going to rely on our panelists to tell you more if you have more questions about the Pequots and who they were and who they are today. But the Pequots are a people that have a long historic link to this region near Long Island Sound in southern Connecticut on the Thames River, spelled like the River Thames in London, pronounced, I believe, Thames. John Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts, and other historians then and until fairly recently like to portray the Pequots as somehow Johnny-come-latelys in this region, as a kind of group that came in and threw their weight around, and everybody kind of wanted to get rid of them, people with no historic association with the place. Well, archaeology shows us that the place that the Pequots now inhabit, the Mashantucket tribal Pequot Nation's current territory, has been continuously inhabited for over 1,200 years, a lot longer than Boston. So these are people with an incredibly long history in this very particular landscape, and they're still there, although once their landscape was much larger than it is today. So the Pequots were indeed a regional power. They were a relatively large group. But they were made up of many smaller towns, and there were many, many individual leaders came together to create the Pequot Nation. We estimate somewhere between 26 and 28 separate towns, separate leaders, with a population of about 32,000. Now keep in mind that Philadelphia and New York didn't reach those population levels until after the American Revolution, really until around 1800. So I mean, this is a dense place, a high number of people per square foot, a thriving place, a mix of agriculture and trade as the basis of their economy. So now the European colonization of New England really began in earnest after 1620. So you had Plymouth establishing in 1620. You had a kind of ratcheting up of Dutch activity with the founding of the Dutch West India Company and their establishment of more settlement in the area of New Netherlands, which isn't that far away from, which isn't too far away from these centers of Pequot and from other indigenous settlement in this region. So everybody has their eye on the prize of the fur trade. Plymouth desperately needs the fur trade, to pay off all of their creditors. They're a weak, poor place that doesn't even have a charter. They don't really have a right to be there. They're sort of hanging on they're kind of riding on the coattails of the Virginia patent. They're deeply in debt. They were poor to begin with, so they are struggling to pay the bills, and they're paying the bills with Indian trade with Native Americans and the fur trade. The Dutch are also a trading company, more than settlers at this point. They are really also thinking about making profit in international trade. They're also thinking furs and also sales of goods to Native Americans. So they're all sort of interested in pursuing trade in the sort of northern areas of the Connecticut River into what is now northern New England, Maine, northeastern Canada, and so on. This is where the best furs are. They're trying to move into territory that in some ways the French are also beginning to occupy in this period. So the Pequots are well situated geographically to be part of that and to become middlemen in that trade, and they do. So in the short term, the Pequot are sort of interested in these trade ties with the French, the Dutch, and the English. They're seeing benefits in the role that they're playing, and they're putting themselves as a people that other Native Americans have to go through in order to receive these goods, and this increases their power and influence. They manage to become sort of a power in the region in which other groups are tributary to them. These are groups that are kinfolk and relatives. I mean, these aren't necessarily the products of violent conquest. These are relationships based on reciprocity, on support, on the Pequots, facilitating trade, and these tributary groups would then provide military alliance, other sorts of goods and services in exchange. So this is the Pequot role, to be kind of the middleman in trade between Europeans and other indigenous people. This is the source of their power. As some indigenous groups in New England were starting to really feel the effect of European disease, right? So any of these groups that are right along the coast are just getting hammered by this exposure to European diseases in the 1620s. The Pequot aren't feeling that as much in the 1620s. They start to feel it in the 1630s as they're having more contact with Europeans and as the sheer number of Europeans increases. And this is the period in which Massachusetts Bay is founded in 1630, a very large colony with a lot of resources, a colony that brings a lot of population, that brings thousands and thousands of people to this region just in the space of a decade. And that demography really starts changing the equation for the processes of power in this region. In addition to furs, there's a food trade circling in this area. And in fact, the Europeans are very dependent on Native American supplies of corn, their hunting, the game they provide. So the Native Americans are in many cases feeding a lot of these colonial outposts and making their colonization possible, getting them through the first couple of years until they can plant themselves. So the trade in foods is also a very important part. And women are the ones who are producing this food in many cases and are themselves also engaged in the trade. So you know how we're seeing in the Middle East today. We saw in Ukraine beginning a year and a half to 2 years ago that history and current events have the capacity to surprise us tremendously. Even in our era of amazing surveillance, of the 24/7 knowledge cycle, of drones, of monitoring communications, et cetera, we are still taken by surprise with by turn of events, by the rapidity with which situations we see as relatively stable in a geopolitical sense can change overnight. And this sort of happened to people living in Pequot territory and to the Dutch and English settlers nearby in 1634, 1635, 1636. So Massachusetts is a place that has a lot of resources. It brings a lot of people with, in this initial migration. And about 13 to 18% of the population that arrives in Massachusetts Bay in the first couple years were indentured servants. So these are people that sign contracts to work for 4 years, usually for 4 to 7 years. Sometimes an apprentice, a younger child, the parents might sign a contract to put that child to service for 10 years. These were contracts. They had specified terms, what the child or the young adult who's signing the contract, what they're supposed to receive, what they owe the master in return. Right? So these were finite, contractual. They involved some goods changing and goods and services exchanging hands. This was the meaning of indentured servitude. So as I said, 13 to 18% of the population of the immigrant flow are these servants. One historian has estimated that wages were higher in Boston, in Massachusetts Bay, by 1637 than they were just about anywhere else in the English world, and possibly even higher than any place in Europe at that moment. Why? Labor was always extremely expensive in colonial environments because there's so much work to do. Everything had to be done. The food had to be grown. Buildings had to be constructed. Roads had to be constructed. Transportation. I mean, every simple task of daily existence required work. Turning wheat into flour, into bread so you could eat it, that was women's work. So think of all of the processing of food and fiber or raw materials, corn, things from the field into food, fibers into clothing. This all had to be done by hand, or goods had to be imported from abroad, and that cost money. And where was the labor? Where were the goods that were going to be exchanged for those things? So these economies are under a lot of pressure. Wages are extremely high. People are looking, and it's hard to get workers. People don't want to necessarily engage in these indentures or work for other people. They want to work for themselves. So this is the tight labor situation. And in this environment, Governor John Winthrop and his adult son, John Winthrop Jr., both petitioned the Massachusetts General Court for the right to keep an Indian apiece as a servant. Now, the implication of this, the special, they had to get a special dispensation from the Massachusetts government to do this. Now, the implication is that this is a voluntary arrangement, that the Native Americans involved were voluntarily engaging in some kind of relationship with the Winthrops and getting compensated for it. But there's no contract for this relationship. So this is one of the first records I can find of a relationship like this within Massachusetts. So the Winthrops, the leaders of Massachusetts, and the man who would become the governor of Connecticut, hiring Native American labor, it seems, in this period. So as I mentioned before, the people's experience in this region changed dramatically, both the experience of the Pequots and other indigenous groups and that of the Europeans in this region changed dramatically between 1633 and 1637. First, the Pequots experienced a devastating, what we think an epidemic of smallpox. They lost extensive population in that particular event. So this is a weakening event. Disrupts the production of food, which creates food pressure, starvation, weakens people in moving forward. So these epidemics have all sorts of kind of long-term impacts. You lose relatives. It's devastating and sad. You might lose elders and their wisdom. You might lose young people in the prime of life, the prime of working life. So these epidemic events were extremely disruptive for Europeans and for Native Americans, and particularly disruptive for Native Americans who are experiencing some of these diseases for the first time. So the Pequots have this stressor. The other stressor is that their partners, the Dutch, and increasingly the colonists from Plymouth and others are coming from Massachusetts Bay and Rhode Island, are wanting to cut the Pequots out of trade, trying to bypass them, to trade directly with their partners in the northern parts of the Northeast, or trying to woo the Pequots, allies and supporters, away from them, right, and bring them into the orbit of New Netherland or a new town some settlers had founded in Wethersfield, Connecticut. Settlers started setting up towns on the Connecticut River. So these are some of the new situations that the Pequots are facing. So many historians have written many books about the origins of the Pequot War. And I find all these books very interesting, but not very many of them have the ring of truth to me. So people have said, it was because of fear of Native American savagery. It was ideas about the inhumanity of Native Americans. That was the reason why Massachusetts, the new colony of Connecticut, and Plymouth decided to attack the Pequots in 1636, 1637. Others said it was a land grab. It was just a desire for this territory. That kind of works maybe for the future colony of Connecticut, but Massachusetts doesn't really move in and take a lot of this territory. It really becomes, most of the territory the Pequots are in becomes part of Connecticut. So the territorial thing doesn't really explain what Massachusetts and Plymouth are doing. I think that all of these three colonial societies, but particularly Massachusetts and Plymouth, were trying to eliminate a regional rival. They came close to, choosing the Pequots as an ally and attacking the Narragansetts instead. I think it was sort of a last-minute decision to topple the Pequots, to organize a regional movement against the Pequots and eliminate them as the group that sat between the Dutch and the English, the group that sat between these Europeans and the trading partners, indigenous trading partners in the North. That it was a kind of a last-minute decision. It was about power, control of trade, and a desire to make these other indigenous groups tributary to Massachusetts Bay, to almost replace these powerful indigenous confederacies with a confederacy that the Europeans would be at the top of. And therefore kind of control trade and access to trade. So what we do know, what the documents do tell us, was that in August of 1636, Massachusetts commissioned an expedition against indigenous people of Block Island. Technically, this was portrayed as a retribution for an earlier killing of an English trader. So there were two Englishmen who had been traded with the Dutch, with the Pequots, with the Narragansett, with other groups in this area, had made occasional voyages to Virginia as well. There were people that kind of moved around this region. Both had been kicked out of Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay respectively for their behavior. One was killed in 1634, after committing a number of violent acts against Native Americans. Another had been killed in 1636, and the initial reaction to these by the Europeans was sort of like good riddance. These people were renegades, they're troublemakers. That even John Winthrop in his journal, says this guy got what he deserved. He probably was asking for it, etc. A month later, the Europeans Massachusetts Bay was mounting an expedition against this group, and against the Block Island Native Americans because they viewed them as killers of one of these renegade English people. So this strikes me as something of a pretext for an invasion and a way to sort of start a regional conflict. So this is a quote from the instructions of the Massachusetts Bay Council to John Endicott. This quote really also stood out to me because the very first instruction in what was really the very first battle in some ways of the Pequot War was an instruction to kill the men but take women and children and bring them away. In other words, bring them back to Massachusetts. That the taking of captives was a sort of primary goal, an important goal, along with sending a message to indigenous people, sending a message to the Pequots, disrupting relationships in this region. So taking captives all of a sudden popped up as a goal of this particular event. So the Pequots had been building forts since about 1614. They had built two large forts that they withdrew into for protection if they felt that they were going to be under attack or going to have different sorts of problems. So these are two different images of the forts at Mystic that the Pequots had constructed. So 1636, that's when Massachusetts sends out its first expedition. But they don't really actually make contact with the Pequots until later in the year. And then the Pequots see the English coming upriver. They have no idea that they're at war with them. They have been sending embassies to Massachusetts. They've been trying to resolve these conflicts over the killings of these European traders. There's been lots of discussion. There's been offers of kind of wampum or cash payments to make this problem go away. So the Pequots actually don't think that their relationship with the English is about to change dramatically. They're not expecting a war on their doorstep. They know what's happened at Block Island. They know about this attack. They're not expecting a regional war, but they got one. So they actually, at that moment, attempt to negotiate with the English about how this war will be conducted. What will the rules of war be? The Pequots ask the English if women and children will be off limits in this war. They're trying to establish what the rules will be. And the English refuse to say that women and children will be off limits, that women and children will be protected. And the European news recounting this conversation, Lion Gardner, says, the Pequots are taken aback at first. They're silent as they digest this news, that women and children could be targeted in this war. And then they respond that, well, okay, well, then we'll kill you, and we'll kill women and children too. I mean, if you want to have it that way. So there's an attempt to establish a baseline, rules of war, as we are hearing about in the world so much today. What should the rules of war be? Should non-combatants, so people who are not adults involved directly in conflict, the soldiers. Soldiers are fair game, but what about civilians? What about non-combatant women and children? Shouldn't they be protected from the violence of war? This is the conversation the Pequots are trying to have with the Europeans, and they don't get the answer they expect or hope to get. So what the Pequots usually did when they engaged in warfare was to send women and children to protected spaces, either in these forts, which were set up in spirals. So there wasn't just a front door. You then had to go around in spirals before you got into the center. And the idea was that there'd be so many defenders within these spirals as you entered that people really couldn't get in and attack the women and children and old people who were protected within the fort. So this is the idea of the design. But what the English did in this particular battle, the Mystic Battle, was once they realized what they were getting into and confronted this design, they set the fort on fire, so that the defenders' bowsprings were bursting into flames as they were trying to shoot at the English kind of coming into the fort. People were on fire. It was death. It was screaming. It was carnage. And as people, to escape, you had to go out of the spiral as well, which was very difficult because then the English kind of were at the choke points of the escape. And surrounding the fort on the outside were various indigenous allies that were supporting the English in this war against the Pequots, who were also interested in toppling them from their position astride, the Dutch and English connections to the fur trade. So they're actually depicted in this image from a contemporary account of the war. So you see the English soldiers are in this inner ring, and indigenous soldiers are in the outer ring. The fighting was so furious that actually many of these indigenous groups, mostly Narragansett and Niantic, who were fighting with the English against the Pequot, some of them the English killed them and took some of them captive as well because they couldn't tell the difference between their allies and the Pequots. So we estimate maybe 700 people were in this fort, and it's possible as many as 500 were actually killed in the night, in the fire, and in the violence that occurred. So this battle has been known as the Mystic Massacre. And even many of the English who participated were really traumatized and disgusted by this event. The younger soldiers, one of the commanders mentioned, just found it unsupportable, had been an unsupportably horrible, violent, inhumane kind of event that they had participated in. And they were very, it was a shocking event even for their participants, the English participants. So this is owl's nest is typical of the kind of refuge outside of forts that women and children would also be sent to escape violence and to be sort of seen as off limits and out of war. But you see for this quote from June 1637, so this is about a month and a half after that Mystic Battle, that Israel Stoughton is writing to John Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts, and he's talking about a boat the commander's name is Giggles. The captain's name is Giggles or Jiggles. But Captain Jiggles is bringing a pinnace with 48 or 50 women and children. And he goes on to talk about the one he's chosen. He's put a coat on her, Stuart Callicott. So this is another officer, Richard Callicott, who lived in Dorchester, and already had some Native Americans living and working in his household. Also chose a particular girl, and also put a coat on her to indicate that she was his choice. And Lieutenant Davenport also desireth one, and he actually notes some markings on her stomach that identify her as a person he wants. So when you read a document like this, several things come to mind. Several things come to my mind. What comes to your mind? Does anybody have any reactions to this document? All women. What do you make of that? Sex. This is something that's hardly ever written about in any of these accounts, and even in historical accounts. But I think there's something there as well. Servitude, for sure. Anything else that's kind of coming to mind? Procreation, and I'll come back to that. I think it's also, when I mentioned that food trade a moment ago and how essential it was, and also in the work that it took to live, for both Indigenous people and European people, in a place where you made everything that you ate and wore, mostly, with the exception of maybe metal, with the exception of kettles and some weapons. You made everything you ate, wore, and used. Women's labor was essential to survival and essential to wealth and power for both Indigenous people and for Europeans. So I think we tend to devalue women's labor today, and housework. Somehow it's just not valuable. But these people understood the value of female labor. Children as well, I think they just thought were sort of controllable. Could be taught, could be molded, weren't as much of a security threat. So what the English did was often execute men and even teenage boys. Like if they just made a guesstimate that this person was of an age to actually be involved in the conflict, they'd kill them too. So you had, after every battle, execution of male captives, sometimes in very grotesque ways. Heads put on pikes. This is like Game of Thrones, Dance of the Dragons, and sitting outside towns and villages. But women and children generally gathered and divided. They divided amongst the New England colonies that had participated in the war and the Narragansett and Niantic and Mohegan who had supported the Europeans in the war. So what's the connection between this war and Massachusetts and the law of slavery that I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture? So in 1641, Massachusetts published the first legal code in English America. So this is the first sort of compendium of law that produced in English America. So, Barbados, Virginia, other places that also had history had produced individual laws and statutes. They had assemblies that made rules. But this was meant to be a complete legal code that was going to influence judicial decisions following its publication. And ministers and magistrates in Massachusetts Bay had been at work at this since 1634. So it had been drafted for quite a while. But I think the timing of this is quite significant because this first legal code of Massachusetts actually mentions slavery. It has, at first, it says there shall be no bond slavery. Then it says except. And it lists the categories of people who could be enslaved. And those categories included, there shall never be any bond slavery, villanage, or captivity among us, unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. So if you willingly sell yourself into slavery, or you're just sold as a slave by a third party in Massachusetts, you are a legal slave. This law goes on to say that enslaved people will have Christian usages, but what it does not say is that you would become free if you got baptized or became a Christian. Christianity did not get you out of slavery in Massachusetts. It did actually in early Virginia. It did in early Bermuda. It did not So Christian conversion was often a way to escape slavery in some other societies at this moment. It was not in Massachusetts. So I think this law has everything to do with the Pequots and a desire to establish the legal status of these Pequot captives in Massachusetts moving forward. And this turns out to be sort of the first complete statute defining slavery in English America, in my view. So Barbados is passing laws that are extending the terms for servants and enslaved people of color. And they're doing that around the same time. But, this is a legal code. This is defining what it is. So I think it's the fact that Massachusetts is the first, and not these societies that we so much associate with the slavery and enslavement. So Virginia is sort of doing it law by law, piece by piece. This is an overarching code, and I think that's its significance. So, and all told, it's very difficult to count the number of Pequot captives. This is a period where there's not censuses, where there's not these sorts of population records. These people are capturing folks on the battlefield. Not every captive's counted. It's very difficult to determine numbers, in other words. But I estimate, about 318 to 320 Pequots were brought to the New England colonies. And that seems like a small number. But keep in mind that, the army that attacked the Mystic Fort was an army of 77. We're still talking about relatively small numbers in these English settlements at this time period. And the Pequot captives came along at a moment 7 years into the establishment of Massachusetts Bay, when that first generation of indentured servants, their contracts were coming up due, right? They were that first generation that had bound themselves for 4 or 6 or 7 years were becoming free. I think this influenced, the instructions to Block Island, to the expedition to Block Island, to bring away the women and children. And the Pequot captives, although they seem small in number, increased the pool of available labor in Massachusetts by 1/3. So this is a significant number for people who want labor and want labor they can control. So the treaty that ended the Pequot War was signed between and among the Mohegans, the Narragansetts and Niantics, and the colony of Connecticut. But the other New England colonies were sort of aware of its terms. And what the treaty spent a lot of time actually talking about the captives, about their distribution, and about the kind of Connecticut and the English people's right to these captives moving forward. It also terminated the Pequot nation. So the term Pequot was not to be used anymore. The Pequots were not to exist anymore as a nation. That they were going to be, the survivors would all be distributed to the various English and Indigenous allies and to be in their territory, but not to be called Pequots anymore. So it was a kind of a moment of a kind of ethnic cleansing. So a lot of Pequots had moved out of this area, had fled the carnage of warfare anyway, had moved to be closer to relatives, or had been taken captive or brought in by the Narragansetts, Niantics, or the Europeans. But those who were taken captive or given to or assigned to other indigenous people had a very different experience from the captives that joined the English. So the Narragansett leadership actually spent a lot of time criticizing what the English were doing with their captives. Once they understood what the English were doing, they started raising objections. They said, captives should be given land and houses and fields. So their idea, when they were thinking about captive, they were thinking about adding to their population. They were thinking about bringing in people who would live in kind of ethnic enclaves within their societies, bolster their populations, bolster their connections, intermarry. In other words, power through population, through kind of an enrichment by addition of these new kinship lines, etc. So this was the Narragansett, Niantic, and Mohegans' ideas. They wanted population. They wanted to add to their tribal nations. They just wanted people to relocate and become, on the surface, Narragansett or Mohegan or Niantic, while continuing to have their homes and families and live their lives. So this was their conception of captivity. For the English, it was becoming something else. So I'll come back to some of these questions. So what happens to the Pequot captives? So the paper trail on the division of captives is not very well developed. So we do know that there's like one or two lines in the Massachusetts Bay Court record that we need to do something about the squaws. This is the word they're using, the disposition of the squaws. So we do know that ministers, magistrates, these are the people serving in the Massachusetts Bay Assembly, high-ranking officials and religious leaders were the people who received shares, who got living captives. Soldiers took captives as their pay. And this became a practice for the next 150 years in New England for wars against Native American groups. This was the ability to take captives and keep them. It was part of the way that Massachusetts, Connecticut, and other colonies paid their soldiers, to plunder, essentially. So I wanted to show you this map of early Boston, because you have to think of early Boston as a place in which a lot of people had Pequot captives in their households. So one group of captives did not remain in New England. This group actually ended up getting exported to the Caribbean in a reverse Middle Passage. In 1638, Massachusetts put together an official ship with a bunch of different products that they wanted to send to Bermuda, but also to the Caribbean, as a way of initiating trade with that region, as a way of making money, to pay for the goods they wanted to import from Europe. And on that ship, they put a number of captives that were taken in what is now Fairfield, Connecticut. These were people who were related to the Pequots. Some had been tributary to the Pequots, but they were not Pequots. They were places where Pequot people had taken refuge. But some cases some of them were fighting the adult men were fighting with the English against the Pequots. And the colonists took them captive anyway, took the women and children captive, executed the men. And so some of these women and a bunch of boys were sent to Providence Island. So Providence Island was a Puritan colony off the coast of Nicaragua. A Puritan colony you might not know about. It was founded at the same time as Massachusetts Bay. It actually only lasted for about another year and a half after the Pequots got there. And so it was basically overtaken by the Spanish. A number of the English tried to evacuate as many people out of the island as they could. So the Pequots were either distributed throughout the Caribbean with their English masters, as the English masters went to other areas that the English were controlling in this region, or were taken by the Spanish and had the same experience, except we're living in a world of Spanish and indigenous slavery. So this experience of the Pequots wasn't as unusual as one might think. We now estimate about 10% of enslaved people in the Caribbean were indigenous. They were indigenous people from North America. They were indigenous people from South America, from Guyana, the northern parts of South America. They were Mosquito Indians from this very region off the coast of where Providence Island is. They were people from central Mexico who were rebelling against the Spanish and were sent into slavery as a punishment. So this region was a massive place for the trade in indigenous slaves, as well as the region that received the most enslaved Africans. This region in Brazil was where most people enslaved in Africa in the slave trade and brought to the Americas went to the Caribbean or to Brazil. And now North American Native Americans are going to the same place. Now, what's also interesting about this voyage, so Pierce apparently was thinking about going to Bermuda, but I think all along the plan was also to go to the Caribbean. And so he sold the Pequots in Providence Island, and he bought enslaved Africans there, and he brought them to Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Bay authorities, because this was not a private voyage, it was a colony-sponsored voyage, hired Richard Davenport to build a slave pen to house these enslaved Africans. And the colony distributed them and sold them. So there's a direct exchange for the Pequot, for these Pequot allies. There were Wagunk and other indigenous groups of Western Connecticut, and it was a direct exchange for them and for these enslaved Africans. And the presence of these Africans set off a frenzy of interest in getting more. So immediately after Pierce's voyage and his return with these enslaved Africans, several other New England ship captains actually went to the Caribbean to buy enslaved Africans. So it sort of set off this interest and frenzy in the idea of bringing enslaved Africans into New England. And these would not be the last New England Indians to end up in a reverse Middle Passage. So the next major conflict between Native Americans and English in New England, King Philip's War, sent people to the Azores, to Spain, to the Mediterranean, as well as to the Caribbean, as well as to Jamaica. So those are all sites where New England Indians were sent as slaves. And think about what the lives of these people were like. I mean, one minute they're at their homes in coastal, their homes with their families and children. They have these incredibly traumatic experiences of war, and then they're shipped off to this place. And then, a year later, under attack by the Spanish, they're removed and split up and divided again. I mean, it's a series of incredibly traumatic experiences, having to adjust to different environments. Tobacco labor, sugarcane labor. I mean, it's just like, these are excruciating and painful stories. I mentioned John Winthrop. He's played a role. You've seen his picture in one of my early slides. So John Winthrop, in a draft will in 1641, listed an ownership of 9 indigenous people. And he didn't mention that they were servants that had a term limit, because you would usually say that in a will. You'd say, I have 6 years or 4 years or whatever. So I have 9 Indians. I'm going to leave them to my, I'm leaving them to my son, and here's how it's going to work out. So these Native Americans were distributed amongst several residences. So many of these elite New Englanders had multiple farms and residences that they wanted laborers for. So this is what Winthrop did. He had a farm in the Boston Harbor, one of the harbor islands. And so he had Native Americans working there. But he also had them living and working in his mansion house, which I believe is where the former Filene's basement was. That was where Winthrop's mansion house was. So, picture a 4-room house, which is what this was, with the Winthrop family, English servants, and Native Americans all living together in tight quarters. Next door was Robert Coles's inn. And Robert Coles also took a Pequot girl who worked in the inn with other English servants. And this inn is where Native American ambassadors from the Narragansett, Niantic, and earlier the Pequot had come. It's often where they held negotiations was at the inn, because the mansion house was too small to accommodate large parties. So this is Coles's inn was sort of a semi-official place in that respect. But Coles ran away Pequot and ran away to the Narragansett country. And there she was recaptured. The English put tremendous pressure on their allies, the Narragansett and Niantic, to return fugitive slaves. There was a sort of fugitive slave clause in that tripartite treaty. And the English followed this up with laws inserted in other treaties with the Narragansetts in particular in 1645 that threatened them with enslavement if they protected any runaways. So in 1638, Roger Williams was actually the slave catcher from Massachusetts for all these Narragansetts that ran away to, or all these Pequots that ran away to Narragansett country, because that's where their Pequot relatives were. He actually returned Mr. Coles's native back to Mr. Coles in his inn. This girl said that she had been beaten by the other servants. She was raped. And she was accused of fornication and burned over by Faneuil Hall, where the old whipping post was, branded publicly by the town beadle, by the Boston town beadle. Other runaways, John Winthrop kind of casually mentioned that a bunch of girls ran away, but they came back and we branded them. So these girls were branded with hot irons for having run away. Let me just talk about maybe the 2 hopes. So 2 hopes. One hope was a young woman who ended up in the household of John Cotton. John Cotton had just remarried a young wife. She was pregnant. He needed help in the home. He wanted help in the home. So he desperately was begging for one of the Pequot captives. He got one, Hope. Hope also proved to be, uncooperative at times with her enslavement. She drank. She talked back. She ran away once, ran away again. Hope was beaten publicly in Salem, and also beaten publicly in both Boston and Marblehead after her second infraction. So, if you think about these incredible public whippings, what we're seeing here is the state, the government is actually involved in the disciplining of both English servants, but particularly these Pequot servants and soon enslaved Africans. That their punishment will be public events, not just private events, in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and elsewhere. Will Williams was a Pequot boy that Roger Williams took. I named him Will. Now there were some people who managed to escape enslavement, or to turn the experience of alliance with the English into something different. So one of those people was Coconut. So Coconut was just visiting relatives in Pequot country. He was from Long Island when he was taken captive. He ended up in the household of Richard Collicott, the one who put a coat on one of the girls and said, "I want this girl," in Dorchester. So Collicott liked Coconut. Coconut served Collicott, but Collicott actually freed Coconut after a time period. He did not keep him as a slave for life. So some of the English did sort of abide by the rules of servitude, but they didn't have to because there was no contract, no legal agreement. So it was really like kind of a case-by-case basis whether people, use the custom of servitude as a guide or just kept people as slaves for life. And I think they were more likely to do so for men and more likely to keep women and children as as slaves for life. That is sort of what the evidence suggests to me. So Coconut was the one who actually taught John Eliot the Wampanoag language because he knew Wampanoag. Helped him write the Wampanoag Bible and other Indian catechisms that ironically, I believe, Rashad, are you using that for some of the language reclamation, as well as Roger Williams's work, that the Wampanoag used in a language revitalization program. John Eliot wanted, and Collicott wanted Coconut maybe to be the first Native American to go to Harvard and become an ordained minister in the Congregational faith. And he chose instead to go back to his relatives and kinfolk in the Long Island area, and kind of serve as a kind of interpreter and advisor to Wyandanch, the sachem of the Montaukett. So I think there's a lot of long-term effects of the Pequot War and a lot of ways that it shaped slavery. So one was that statute, and that statute really remains the law of slavery in Massachusetts. Until slavery ends. And slavery in Massachusetts did not end by statute. It didn't end by a positive action. It ended because of lawsuits brought by the enslaved. It ended by kind of self-liberation of the enslaved. Ironically, these New England states and colonies, and states really, because this was after the American Revolution, were extremely slow to end slavery by statute. Connecticut didn't finally end slavery until 1840. So this Massachusetts statute really influenced the whole region. And I think what's interesting about it is that it does not specify that slavery is hereditary. It does not specify race in slavery, although it came to, race and slavery came to be associated through practice in this place. And that issue of the hereditary nature of slavery is, I think, a very interesting one. And I think the reason why Massachusetts and Connecticut, which talked about it quite a bit, making slavery hereditary, and had constant debates about this, didn't make it hereditary. It was because so many Native Americans were that first and second generation of enslaved people, and they were reluctant to do so. They were okay with making African slavery hereditary in law, but they were not okay with making Indian slavery hereditary in law. So practice often made these people slaves in law, in practice, but they weren't slaves in law. So let me end with a case that involves somebody with a Pequot connection. So in 1739, a man named Caesar showed up in this Connecticut courtroom. He had already met with this Justice of the Peace, Joshua Hempstead, earlier, and Hempstead had sent his case forward. So what Caesar argued is that he had been held illegally in slavery all of his life. He was, at that time, enslaved to a blacksmith in the New London area. And he walked away from that man's service and just came to the court and said, you know, I am one of the subjects of the Lord Sovereign our King and not to be subjected to slavery or bondage. So he told a story about his mother, a Pequot Indian. Her name was Betty. And what Caesar said was that Betty had been illegally enslaved as a child, that she was caught up in another war as a young refugee, King Philip's War, which what I just described on an even larger scale of disruption, refugee movements, people fleeing violence, armies just running around taking captives right, left, and center, wars that start for a variety of reasons, geopolitical reasons, becoming wars to take captives, which was what happened in the Pequot War, also happens in King Philip's War. So Betty, was a Pequot who ended up by herself being auctioned off at a dockside in New London. She was purchased by a ship captain. When he died, his wife remarried a ship captain in Long Island. So she was taken to Long Island, formed a relationship with an enslaved man there, had Caesar, and Caesar's parents treated her like a slave for life and him like a slave for life, or Caesar's slaveholder. Eventually, he was sold several times and ended up back in New London working for the blacksmith. And, a jury agreed with Caesar, agreed that his mother should not have been enslaved, should have been freed after a set term, at the very least, that therefore she was not a slave when he was born, and therefore he was not a slave, but in fact a free man. So Caesar gained his freedom through lawsuit by claiming Pequot heritage, actually, by pointing out the illegal enslavement of indigenous people in this region. So, I like to end at least with some hope, with some story of change. And I do feel the hopeful element of that story is not just Caesar's ability, to make that challenge, and his ability to be heard in court, but also that a Connecticut jury found in his favor, and did actually try to right this particular wrong. The shame of it is that he, as an individual, had to make a case and gain his freedom, and so many other people in similar situations who didn't have the language, the social capital, the knowledge, and everything, the legal support and everything it took for someone to make a successful freedom case, for other groups that didn't have that, for other enslaved Native Americans in this region. So I think we should turn it over to our amazing other commentators and have a more general discussion about all these events. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret. Some of that's difficult for us who are of Indigenous descent to hear, but those are stories that we have to grapple with if we are ever to find common ground and move on in a world that's more just and peaceful. Before we go on to that, I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that this entire series was made possible by a generous grant from the Massachusetts Council for the Humanities, and we thank them very much for that. Before I ask a few questions of Chairman Thomas and Rashad, I would like to call the Tribal Council to the stage who would like to gift something to you. Margaret, you want to come to the center?
Ladies and gentlemen, one of the most significant traditional gifts that we can give are blankets. There are many, many reasons for that. And so when people tell history that lines up with what we have always said and passed on to one another, had passed on to us by grandparents and great-grandparents. We want to acknowledge work that the tribe is appreciative of, and so our tribal leaders of today wanted to present this blanket in appreciation for those reasons.
Thank you so much. This means so much to me. It's so beautiful. This is.
These are different pieces of our tribal community and pieces that are historically significant to us. We could do an hour on the blanket alone, but you can see that it represents both old, historic, and modern pieces of the tribal community and some of the things that are really most special to us. So not many people get these gifts. We're happy to present this one to you.
Thank you.
And so I would ask for a guess from anyone in the audience while they are thanking her personally. If you had to guess what year it was when we as Mashantucket Pequot people first gained the right to determine who our own people were according to Connecticut law. Anybody want to guess what year that might have been? Yes, the year on the bottom of that blanket. And that's what made me want to describe it to you. So all the way up until 1975, Connecticut told us who our people were and who our people were not. And that is a pretty good contrast to the rest of what you've heard today. So
there are a few items that I'd like to ask you, Michael, and Rashad to give your comments on. Professor Newell presents a well-researched and documented evidence surrounding the ultimate purpose of the Pequot War. Can you tell us why her work is important and significant and how it aligns and amplifies the oral histories and the traditional knowledge that the tribe has about the war and also the aftermath of the war?
I think the work is significant for many reasons. One of them being that the American public especially tends to give more credibility, more credence to documented history than to the oral history of our people. There's always a failure to recognize that documented history is often just a perspective of an individual person and often hasn't even been passed down from a grandmother. But that being what it is, documents tend to have more modern credibility. And so when things that we have said all along line up with newly documented history, we want to be sure to share that with folks so that they can see what the truth was all along. And whether the subject matter is the Pequot War or the land bridge that my people did not come over, the approach is precisely the same.
First and foremost, I just want to say thank you to Professor Newell. And she has a well put together presentation, and it's worth a lot of praise because she says a lot of things that, you know, we talk privately amongst ourselves in our community about certain things that we want, you know, the public to know that might not be in, you know, one of the many published books about the Pequot War. And she has certainly hit right on the nose a bunch of these topics. And yeah, I just want to say to start, thank you for that. So to go along with the question, this is important because if you don't know our oral history and confirm it, like Mike said, with some written documents or things like that, you might have a skewed view of Indigenous people, who we are, how many of us there were at a certain time, and things like that. But when you get this information out, it's easy to see that, you know, we're still around. We're not extinct like they say in a lot of these books. And as Mike brought up as well, until 1975, we weren't allowed to even exist. So if you weren't actually Pequot and knew that, you would think that the Pequots were extinct. So having a presentation like this really is great, and it shines a light on, you know, our people and our continued resilience.
Thank you. So the war and its aftermath and colonization in general had far-reaching impacts on your tribe and the tribes in the area, from dispossession to the loss of your identity, to loss of family members, language, culture, enslavement, and ultimately death. Can you share with us your thoughts on how your tribe's resilience played a role in its continued existence and sovereignty up until today?
Yeah, I think relationships build resilience, and the relationships that were able to be maintained within the tribes and between the tribes of this region were a key part of that resilience. And it's a hidden piece even today. The general public in America doesn't understand how deeply connected tribal communities are to one another. Those that are local, close to one another, but also in many instances, you know, folks who are far away. And so there's an entire community of our people who tried to get away from colonization that is all the way in Wisconsin at this point, a place called Brotherton. And so there's an awful lot of history that we would love for people to pay attention to, and you know, those resilient people who passed on everything they knew, despite being treated horribly for it for their entire lives, are stronger people than any of us alive today, in my view.
Mike hits on a good point, and something I want to bring up that wasn't brought up was that, yes, we are members of the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation, but there's also an Eastern Pequot Tribal Nation, which is state recognized in Connecticut. Previous to the Pequot War, there was no separation between the Mashantucket Pequots and the Eastern Pequots. That designation was made depending on which tribe or which colony the slaves from the Pequot War were divided into. So that, along with our Pequot family members who maybe stayed with a different tribe and now are known as a different tribe, or like Mike said, ones that went to Wisconsin, we're all connected in this area. We like to call ourselves sister tribes with all southern New England, especially the ones who have went away from this area. We're still connected with them. So those connections, as Mike said, are what keeps us going. And I just wanted to recognize all of the connections that we have, not just specifically the Mashantucket Pequot.
And these issues are alive right now today. These same things are happening, not with the savagery of the era that we've just talked about for a while, but the very same issues that ignore our people out of existence or attempt to are happening right now. I talk about the connection between tribal communities. There are 2 federally recognized tribes in Connecticut, but there are a half dozen tribes altogether, and we have relationships with every single one of those tribal communities. Our Nipmuc relatives in the northeastern part of Connecticut no longer have a tribal land base that they control. They are controlled by a town called Thompson, Connecticut today, which is about to take away their ancestral land base for back tax collection that they should have never been charged in the first place. And so we will literally see one of the original pieces of tribal community in this place that existed during the time of the research that you just saw continue to happen again. And so today it's with pens and court decisions rather than bayonets and muskets, but the same dynamics continue to play out. And that's the reason that the work is so important and that public awareness is so important today. Because lots of people will look at the Pequot tribe and the Foxwoods Casino, or how many people are paying attention to our Nipmuc relatives there in a place called Chabunagungamog, where we have interacted with them and sat and eaten and danced and sang for generations. We may not find them there 20 years from now. And if that's the case, shame on all of us, and shame on America.
So can you describe the work the tribe has done to preserve and educate others from your point of view about the history of colonization, the effects of the Pequot War through the extraordinary Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center, and how your Cultural Resources Group works to preserve your identity, your cultural heritage, and specifically your language?
Yeah, so as an employee in the Cultural Resource Department, it's my responsibility to be a source of knowledge for my community on everything that has to do with my tribe, past, present, and future. Because culture is not just something that was, 300 years ago. We're still practicing our culture now, and whether that means, giving a talk like this is a cultural thing. This is now a Pequot thing. Or if it's me at home, using traditional tools to make a flute or a bow, that's a cultural thing as well. So using the resources I have, which a lot of them are from my elders, one of them sitting next to me here, and also the resources we have in our library, it's easy to do, some of the things like, cross-reference Pequot War histories, look at some of our oral history on the Pequot War and figure out, does this English account add up with our recollection of the event? And does the English account 40 years after the war, which there were a few accounts that were written by John Underhill and Lyon Gardner 20 to 30 years after the war, and then there were some that they wrote, a few weeks after the war happened, and they're completely different documents. The ones right after the war were basically war logs, so they talked about things like, how many soldiers died, how brutal it was, what was actually going on, and then in the 20, 30 years later, they talked about how it was God's will that he wiped the Pequots from in front of us during our war, and they stood no chance. And then you read the other one, and it says, I was in the middle of a gunfight, and two guys to my left and right died with arrows, and I had to run to get out of there. So it's things like that we do to continue. I'm also a language teacher, so I look at a lot of historical sources. Luckily, the English took very good records of all the Southern New England languages, which are very closely related. So piecing together our language, which we were forbidden to speak for a long time, has been a passion of mine for the last few years. And I'm honored to be able to compile some words and try to bring back the language to my people.
Our museum is a great gift for any group of minority people on Earth, frankly. To be able to control the content of a museum and tell your own story your own way is a special gift, is an opportunity. The vast majority of the world's museums are controlled by a single culture, none of them brown. And so that is a gift. It is also a gift for that to be the place where we can interact with like-minded American folks that just want to know the truth and be able to pass that down to their children. But the parts that Rashad talks about are the most special part. There are people who have been gone from our tribal community for 3 or 4 generations who can come back having been subjected to all the horror that you just heard about and chased away from who they were, that can come back to their roots. They can come back and find their family and their genealogy and learn to speak their language all over again And so those are probably the most important activities that happen at the museum, but the others are very important as well.
Hi, this was really great. I'm just gonna get straight to my question. So I hear the word resilience, and I feel like it can provide a cushy feeling for people who are actually like not part of the day-to-day of just what it means to be resilient. And resilience comes from people. It's not this ether where people have lived for generations and they're still around, and then you're like, oh, resilience. No, it's from action that people have taken. And I'm curious for both of you, what personally led you to the work that you're doing today? I feel like in a world, this capitalist world where you just try to survive, pay your rent, I'm curious what motivated you to go beyond that and actually do work that ensures that you're heard and others around you are supported.
My first answer would be leadership by example. My mother was a community organizer as a young woman before being elected as a tribal leader later on in life. Her mother, my grandmother, was a community organizer before becoming an elected tribal leader later on in her life. And so when you are made by people who spend every ounce of energy fighting for their own people, you can barely help but to do at least some of the same work that you have seen. My grandmother, as a woman of color, formed her first community rights-based organization in 1966, 2 years before I was born. And so, and nobody in this room, I can see many are in my generation, needs to be told what it was like for a minority woman to lead a group speaking truth to power in 1966. And so the people, we stand on the shoulders of giants, we truly do. This is not just a catchphrase. And so the people that made us, and even the siblings of the people that I'm talking about. And so for me, my grandmother had brothers, many, many brothers, who would make us sit down in the days when you could still make a child sit down for as long as you wanted to if you were their elder. And they would play games with us and say, boy, I'm going to tell you something, and then you're going to tell me back. And if you tell me back exactly what I told you, I'm going to give you some candy. Now, y'all can look at me right now today and tell that candy has motivated me for a long, long time. But for a piece of chocolate, these folks are actually passing oral tradition to you. You don't even know it. You think you're just earning chocolate. And so it's really, those people were resilient. From my perspective, we're not very resilient. We're mostly spoiled Americans who are also holding on to the culture that made us. But those kinds of people, and those are only a couple of examples, there are dozens of them who endured an America that would frankly make me put my hands around someone's neck and just get locked up or killed pretty quickly, who endured those things and gave us our history and our values and all of the things that they could, despite what they endured. Indentured servitude was a part of the story that we just talked about. Every one of us that is here from the Pequot tribe today comes from a grandfather whose name was Clifford, who was an indentured servant, and that didn't end until the early 1900s. And so he had one of the 10-year indentured servitude assignments as a child, and he made all of us who sit here today. And so when folks come from that kind of hardship and they pass on to you, you take it really seriously because you know that they gave you a better life than they could have ever imagined or had for themselves.
What brought me to this path that I'm on? It's a little bit of a long story, but when I was young, I was around, I was fortunate enough to be born at a time when we had a lot of family coming back together on our reservation. We were doing a lot of cultural activity. My mother over here was on our tribal council when I was young, so I was kind of brought up around that. But one thing that happened to me that I think happens to a lot of indigenous youth in this country is once I was a teenager, all that stuff kind of went out the window. I was in high school, I went to college, you know, I almost had completely forgot about everything that I was doing when I was younger. And after graduating college, I tried to get a job in my field, which I was successful in, but there was something missing. I was in the job for a few years, and looking at some of the people sitting in front of me over here, I remembered being a kid and, you know, wanting to be around them. And they're all in these positions now of community leaders. And that kind of brought back the role model in me, where I saw them as role models, and now they're up here, you know, at the highest level of our government, leading our people, and it made me want to get on the path that I'm on now, because I know there's a lot of youth who might have been going through the same situation as me, or maybe when they were younger, they were around things, and now they're out of it, but if they see someone like me doing what I'm doing now, it's gonna hopefully help them get back into this path. And this is something that I was told by one of my cousins who heard it from his uncle, who was, we all called him our Uncle Kenny Merrick, who was a staple in our community for a long time. He taught our people a lot of things, but he told my cousin Philip, who had told it to me, there's two roads that us as indigenous people we have to walk. There's a red road, which is our traditional road, and then there's the blue road, which is the modern American road. And it's how you balance that, which road you're on. You know, we can't just be on one, because if you're just on one, especially the blue road, you're missing all of your cultural things. If you're just on the red road, it's impossible in our modern society. So you have to balance that. And I think about that a lot. So that's what kind of keeps me going where I am right now.
Any other questions?
Thank you so much for this great presentation. And while on the subject of language, I was curious to know when the court case about Caesar and his mother Betty, in the court, if there are court records, what languages did he represent himself? What language did he speak? Was he versed in English, or did he have someone accompanying him through the court?
He spoke English. But, you know, I think you put your finger on something important. So for the first or second generation of the enslaved, you know, especially these people who are being enslaved in the 17th century, and it's happening both in warfare and in peacetime, because people just start kidnapping Indians and presenting them as slaves, neighbors. There's enslavement during peacetime. The language issue makes it very difficult for them to seek redress, and is a huge barrier to trying to challenge illegal enslavement. So you really needed to have at every stage for these successful students, so Caesar, the language wasn't a barrier, but a group of lawyers helped him. And I have another case of a Narragansett girl who's illegally enslaved. She's really trafficked across Long Island Sound into Connecticut. And this happens a lot too. There's really human trafficking going on of children just being kind of, who are maybe indentured servants, but they're being sold, and the bill of sale all of a sudden, they'll be sold 2 or 3 times, and the last one will say they're a slave. Or we also talked in the break that Native Americans are listed as biracial or mulatto, or in other words, their indigeneity is erased as well sometimes in these transactions. So she's also gets some legal help and assistance. So without which, it's very difficult to make these courts work for the freedom of people of color. You did need extra help, but in the 17th century, I think the language barrier is everything. But on the other hand, the language is, and culture is, is a strength. I mean, this, I think the English are very much wanting to assimilate and acculturate and take children because they can be acculturated into English culture, but which is a loss then of kin ties and identity and meaning for the enslaved. So it's always a complicated. Acculturation gives you some weapons, to battle slavery, but it also means it's come at a price. So I know these gentlemen are all kind of, and the question about resilience I thought was awesome too, because the Pequot reform almost immediately after the war is the amazing thing. They go back. The ones who had been distributed, as tributaries of other nations moved back. They reclaim their land, and they actually finally get recognition from Connecticut colony that this is their place. They live their practice, so it's like a constant battle of assertion of them and their identity that has to be constantly battled. It doesn't just happen. You're absolutely right, and that comes as a cost too. But it is. I think the proof is in the activities of these activists who are here tonight.
And the tribal community that we live in today was first established and we were confined to in 1666. Ironically enough, with the way folks like to impose their values upon us, if you ride by the reservation sign, it says 1667 because their religious convictions wouldn't allow them to put 3 6s in a row on the sign.
Going back to your question about language in the court document, Caesar, most likely, it seems he probably was okay with English. But one of the things we look at in the language department, a lot of the early court records are actually in the local language, the local Algonquin language, because a lot of the Indians did not speak English. So there was most likely an interpreter there, and they wrote down the entire thing in Algonquin. So the official court documents, which you can still see if you go to courthouses, will be written in Algonquin for, petty crimes or anything like that. So that was a transliteration? Yes.
Yeah, they would typically hire our people who could speak both languages or indenture them or enslave them at other times, but they always used translators. The first reason they used translators was capitalist in nature. I mean, the translation approach comes from trade, which is the first focus.
And on that same note, we talked a little bit about John Eliot in here, I believe, and he was actually the author of the first Bible published in North America, which was completely in Natick, one of the Algonquin dialects. And nowadays, you hear about John Eliot, about he's the apostle to the Indians, about how he spoke fluent. But what you don't know is that he had, 8 or 9 slaves or servants who actually translated the Bible for him. And he has his name on it, and none of their names are on it. So now we just think, John Eliot must have learned, the language fluently enough to write the whole Bible. Well, no, he had, 9 indigenous servants writing it for him.
And so, Lance, a question for you. Who actually cut down George Washington's cherry tree?
You're asking me?
No. Just
I think you had a question here from Councilor Menahan, and then Roxanne will go to the live stream for some questions.
I had a question for the professor. First, I want to thank you for just being open and as transparent as possible. Like, this was beautiful stuff. Would you discuss the Mystic Fort? Internally, we've always been taught that it was the Mystic Village. And there's a dialect wherever it's identified publicly, it does go back to the fort versus the village. And we've always been taught that that was positioned like that to justify the attack on men and women. But you're the first person that publicly stated outside of Pequot or other sister tribes of some of the trying to understand the limits on war and things like that. So I want to thank you for that, and then just ask you, how do you feel about the usage of village as opposed to fort, and if we should publicly go back to consider it a village? Part of your earlier argument was they was asking if men and women would be open for attacks, because it wasn't allowed prior to that. And then later on you talked about, and I love the owl's nest comparison, something that we're also teaching the kids about nowadays. But knowing those values, I'm just wondering how you feel towards the two different viewpoints and what we should start maybe looking to put more in stone and stick with one version, and if that could possibly be the village.
Well, I would actually, bow to your wisdom on this, and I actually like the idea of calling it a village. You could call it a fortified village. These words do matter, and I think, historians have been having a discussion recently about the kind of language we use to describe, to talk about a corn patch as opposed to a farm. Which is more valuable? Which is owned? So in other words, the people often use very casual language, historians, when talking about indigenous property, indigenous economic activity, their farming, etc. And it belittled those activities. So as you said, to call something a fort versus a village, is it a military installation, or is it a home where people are living, where men, women, and children are living? So I think you've given me something to think about. And maybe I should just start calling it the Mystic Village. I do think they were probably fortifying a little more, because the thing is, the Europeans just escalated violence for everybody. Even at times when they were, when they were in alliance and trade, their presence, the Native Americans engaged in warfare before the Europeans came. Mm-hmm. But the Europeans just created more reasons for war, provided deadlier weapons. We're more interested in killing people in warfare. Indigenous people might sometimes leave a battlefield even if they were winning, if with too many casualties, because they didn't want to lose people. So their ethics and ethos of what to gain. So the level of violence, the mortality in war, all these things had increased with the arrival of Europeans. So the Pequot in some ways are responding to a reality. But the forts are not, like I said, it's a spiral, so the Haudenosaunee are doing the same thing in some cases for the Mohawk, and they're, are encircling their longhouses with palisades and so on and so forth. So it doesn't mean that you're inviting or excusing a war, But I like the idea of calling it maybe a village or a fortified village, a place of refuge, as well as, a place of living, is maybe a better way to think about it.
It's important to know that the palisade wasn't the extent of the community that was there. And so yesterday I went to Mystic and stood in a spot where I could see Pequot Hill, which is the land underneath of that fort site. And I could look in the other direction and see our ancient burial ground on what is now a peninsula and is sadly called Mason's Island. And so we have a burial ground there that is older than the settlement of the country naturally. And I purposefully went to the one spot on the hill in between them so that I could see both of them and just think about what we were going to talk about today. And so our thumbprint on Mystic historically is much, much larger than the village on Pequot Hill, the fort, the palisade, whatever terminology you want to use. That entire waterfront area and Pequot Hill were all precious to us, mostly because it was one of the easiest places to feed your people in the spring and summer. But it's just important to know about the broader community of Mystic. We were obviously folks who moved from one community to another, and so where we are stuck today and have been since 1666 just happens to be the place where we would winter, because it can get pretty tough down there on the water in Mystic during those months. And so, anyway, we have a larger historic presence in Mystic that was at the root of the tribal leaders' comment.
A time check, Diane? Okay, we probably just have time for one question from the live feed. I know there's a lot of people there and you have a lot of questions, but they're
There's
gonna kick
indeed
us out
lots
library,
of questions on the live feed. Thanks for touching on the role, the ship Desire. Thanks for touching on Roger Williams and his little-known actions. People would like to know where more information can be found on what happened, the Pequot and the Caribbean, and also, sorry, I'm trying to summarize very quickly here. Pequot's being sent to the Azores. People very much appreciated knowing about that. Where can more information be found? Let me end with that unless we get a few minutes more.
Yeah, we don't, there's not a lot of information on what happens to the Pequots who are sent to Providence Island once Providence Island falls into Spanish hands and the people are dispersed. Thomas Stanton, his Connecticut part of the war effort, gave a testimony in, I think, 1659, and he said 2 of the women in that group had actually ended up in the island of Nevis, which was an English colony in the Antilles. So it's sort of at it's the lower arc of the, not too far from Barbados, so there's a lot of slavery, and some English presence and control there. So, there they would have been involved in first tobacco cultivation, then sugar cultivation, living plantation life. And, the Winthrop children, a number of the Winthrop children end up as planters, slaveholders in those parts of the Caribbean. The Yale has a thing called the Yale Indian Papers Project, where they've digitalized a lot of documents relating to Native Americans. So there's a document on that set about a group of Indians. I think includes some Nipmucs, mostly Wampanoags, who end up getting exported to Tangier, who end up in the Mediterranean as galley slaves. So there's a document from the British naval officer who bought them at a slave market in Spain. So this is during King Philip's War. So we know where some people ended up, and some people went to the Azores. Some they were from Maine, who were enslaved and sold there. Some of them actually managed to get back. They were in leadership, Wabanaki, who were in leadership, and they managed to return. So we do have some stories where we know what happened to people and where they went. I've had people contact me sometimes who are descended from some. The only times I know what the legal documents say, and I don't know where the story goes after that. But sometimes people will contact me who know genealogy, who have family records. And I imagine the Mashantucket Pequot Nation, who's been doing a lot of research on this subject, probably knows more than I do at this point about some of these individual captives.
We do, and we get visits from relatives who have been literally dropped in various parts of the world over hundreds and hundreds of years. And so we've had a visit in the last 6 months or so with relatives from New Zealand who are descendants of William Apes, one of our more famous Pequot authors historically. Most importantly, you should read firsthand accounts in that regard. And so please remember the name Brinky Tucker, who is one of our Bermuda relatives. And so the people who were sent to Bermuda over the course of time concentrated themselves on a little island off of Bermuda called St. David's Island. We reconnected in the late 1990s with these relatives, and every 2 years there is a reconnection festival that either happens here or there in Bermuda, and we're in regular contact with these relatives. Brinky actually wrote a book that is the story of his life, for lack of a better way to describe it, and that has all of the oral history that comes from those Bermuda relatives in his book.
There is 2 questions here about a person saying, I don't quite understand what conditions of slavery were legal and what were sort of illegal, non-legal conditions. And also another person asks, so did judicial indenture of Indigenous people in Massachusetts end when enslavement ended? And if not, how long did it continue?
Well, those are good and big questions. My take on this law of slavery question is that enslavement took a village. So in other words, people kind of did what they could get away with. If their neighbors were going to let them get away with it, if the local, sheriff, local court, whatever representatives of local government there were would let them get away with it, they'd push it to the limit. So people really just converted term servants into slaves. They tried to enslave the children of these Pequot captives and those that came after them, even though they weren't allowed to do so in law. So the law said X, and people, did Y as much as they could. So at different times, neighbors actually did call out this stuff, though. White neighbors, English neighbors. So I only see the cases. I see the unusual cases where people either challenged or somehow this situation came to authorities' attention. So I see those cases, or people end up in law enforcement some way or the other. So I think there's many cases where this stuff's just going on locally, and it's just people are just getting away with it. So when did indenture end? No, I think you just heard that his grandfather was indentured. So that again you had these customs of indenture, contractual, but nonetheless often compulsory in Rhode Island and now I'm learning today in Connecticut, where the local sheriff is sort of like the post-Reconstruction South, where the local sheriff was basically going around telling people that kids had to be in working in a white household, or be arrested for vagrancy or so on. In Rhode Island, I have a little project I'm working on. Like overnight, almost the records go from people getting sentenced to servitude. This is in the late 1700s, early 1800s. To incarceration. So that there's like kind of a very rapid shift from servitude to all of a sudden incarceration. So that seems to be, we could talk about those sorts of connections that other historians have discussed as well.
Well, and incarceration has long been another form of servitude, and frankly still is today. If you look at the American criminal justice system very closely, America has 22% of the world's prisoners and 4% of the world's population. If you don't think that's a systemic problem, I'd like you to show me something that is. And so these things have been a part of American governance and culture and society since the first folks arrived here, and they still are today. And frankly, until we acknowledge them, there's really nothing we can do to change those situations now, and that was exactly the same as yesteryear's assessment.
And can you tell us how to get in touch with the Mashantucket Pequot Museum?
Yes, pequotmuseum.org. We would be happy to help you find Brinky Tucker's book, or if you want to talk to Bermuda relatives directly, or Maori, or any other Pequot relatives. And we love it when folks come home from faraway places that they've been for 4 or 5 generations. We'd be happy to share any information in those areas with you so that you can hear it firsthand from the people who lived it. There's no substitute for that.
Unfortunately, we have to, sorry, Rashad, the library is going to start a series of alarms to kick us out of here. And as much as we would love to talk longer, we do have to end this now. I can't thank you, Chairman Thomas, Rashad, Professor Newell, enough for this presentation.